Dr. Kona, let's get straight to the point. 5.5 years as a diplomat to the United Nations in New York. You returned to Sri Lanka 1.5 months ago. Following the change of regime in 8th January 2015, what was the mindset like of the United Nations on Sri Lanka?
My personal view is that Sri Lanka, the United Nations perception of Sri Lanka at the time was very positive. In fact, over and over again, I had been assured at the highest levels that Sri Lanka had fallen off the radar, the UN radar, which was a very positive thing to hear, because you know that in 2009, the UN was very much focused on Sri Lanka. That changed. Now, on the other hand, there was an acknowledgement that Sri Lanka had taken considerable measures to resettle the displaced, to develop the infrastructure, the roads, the electricity connections, the schools, the health clinics, etc. So there was a very positive view about this. Of course, I'm not saying that there were no questions being asked, there were, but Sri Lanka had dropped off the radar. So Sri Lanka was not a priority for the UN, and I would say that to the vast majority of the member states who may have been interested in Sri Lanka earlier, Sri Lanka had fallen somewhere else, drifted somewhere else.
Dr. Kona, you were attached with the United Nations system for nearly 10 years, and then you served as a diplomat in the United Nations for nearly 5.5 years.
Yeah.
However, the thinking of the United Nations changed after the 8th of January 2015. Agreed or disagreed?
I don't think it changed. I think there was a certain warmth in the attitude. When the government changed and the foreign minister visited the United Nations, there was a noticeable warmth in the attitude. And I'm saying this without denigrating in any way the attitude towards the representatives of the previous regime. They came to New York, they were received warmly, they were also accommodated warmly. There is, I earlier mentioned the fact that there were some questions still being asked with less vehemence, and the UN was now expecting those questions to be responded to. Mainly the questions relating to human rights and questions relating to accountability.
Did the United Nations disliked the former administration?
I wouldn't say so, no. I could categorically say that there was no such dislike in the United Nations.
However, after the 8th of January, the United Nations changed its policy towards Sri Lanka. You saw the report of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights in Geneva postponing the report as well, the publication of this particular report in question. Can the United Nations change its policies based on a different government coming into play?
I think we are mixing up two things here. The United Nations, the political headquarters of the United Nations in New York, and the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. The High Commissioner is an arm of the United Nations, acting almost independently most of the time. So it's not the United Nations that made this noticeable change. It was the High Commissioner. The High Commissioner agreed to postpone the release of the report. You know, there are different angles to this. One is that by delaying the release, now the report could be further strengthened because there's more time to obtain other information which they may have missed earlier. The High Commissioner himself has said that. He said that this will give him the opportunity to strengthen the report. On the other hand, Sri Lanka also has the opportunity now to deliver on some of the commitments that we have made on human rights violations, on accountability. This poses a challenge to Sri Lanka on the one hand, and on the other hand gives the High Commissioner a greater opportunity to examine every angle of the allegations.
How do you view it, Dr. Kona? Is it an advantage or a disadvantage?
I think it is both. It's an advantage to us because we have the opportunity to deliver on the commitments made or the expectations of certain countries of the international community. And on the disadvantage would be that the report could very well be strengthened as a result of the time lag, extra time that they have.
Is Sri Lanka on the right track in terms of human rights? Because now the country is engulfed in this 100-day program, the 19th Amendment, so on and so forth. This is the core question of the international community. Human rights, accountability issues. Do you think Sri Lanka is on the right track?
Let's get two or three things clear here. One is that the international community as a whole has never really put Sri Lanka on the dock. The international community consists of 193 members of the United Nations. It's only a small percentage of countries, especially Western countries, who were posing these questions to Sri Lanka. And admittedly, they are very powerful countries, very influential countries. But a small segment of the international community was posing these questions. Secondly, the international community's relationship with Sri Lanka should not be limited to a perception that we have to deal with only those few countries in the West. There are a range of some other countries. I mean, in the East, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Africa, Egypt, etc., whose perception of Sri Lanka was not negative at all. So they were behind Sri Lanka. And that's a vast majority of the membership of the United Nations I'm talking about.
Dr. Kona, you were talking about perception. Do you in any way believe that the present administration is moving away from the East, relationships that were built by the former regime and individuals like you over the years? Do you think we're moving away from the East and getting close to the West?
My hope is that this is not true, because our relationship with the East is not a relationship that started yesterday. It started hundreds of years ago. I mean, on the basis of Buddhism and trade, we had very strong links with countries of the East, China, Indochina, etc. And then more recently, you recall that in 1953, we concluded the Rubberized Pact with China at a time when there were sanctions imposed against China. More recently, China stood by us very staunchly during the conflict with LTT. And in fact, Chinese assistance, Pakistani assistance, helped us a great deal to end that conflict when we did. Of course, I'm not saying that countries like India and others didn't help. They did, very importantly, and provided very important assistance. But once the conflict was over, there was a big challenge that Sri Lanka confronted. We ended the conflict, but we had to develop fast. We looked around for funds for development. There were no funds in the world at the time. There was a financial crisis in the West. In fact, countries like the US were looking for funds from elsewhere. There was one country with surplus funds, and China came up with the goods and helped us to get up on our feet. So I hope that whatever changes we introduce to our foreign policy, we will maintain that relationship. It's very an important relationship to us. It's also to be remembered that when we had difficulties in international fora, China, without any qualification, without any conditionality, stood with us. Again, I'm limiting myself to comments on China. There are other countries also who did that. So we should not forget what our friends did when we had difficulties. It's very important to consolidate our relationships with the countries in the West, and I think that's a very important thing for us, because we have always been non-aligned, and this is a hallmark of non-alignment, having good relations with the East and the West. We should develop those relationships, but not at the expense of the solid relationships we've already had.
Dr. Kohana, one of the allegations leveled at the previous regime is the fact that the previous regime did not have a foreign policy. You were part of the previous regime. You were appointed by the previous regime as ambassador to New York. You were also the foreign secretary for some time. How do you view this? Did Sri Lanka have a foreign policy?
I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration, because we did have a foreign policy. It was based on the concept of non-alignment. we try to develop relations with both the East and the West. In some cases, we are more successful than the others, and there are good reasons for that. Unfortunately, this created a perception of not having a policy. And also, it's important to remember that there is a distinction between foreign policy and the administration of foreign policy. Foreign policy is the attitude that we have towards countries, how we develop relations with those countries, how we interact with countries. The administration of the foreign policy is in the hands of diplomats and other administrators. That's a different thing altogether in my view. Sometimes they interact, and bad administration causes difficulties with foreign policy, but you always have to remember that policy is the attitude we have towards other countries, individual or as groups, the way we develop those relationships and how we interact with those countries.
The UN resolution clearly states that intervention of the international community is needed when formulating the domestic mechanism, the domestic process in which the Sri Lankan government has promised special mandate holders should arrive in Sri Lanka and assist if the need be. How do you view this? Will this in any way affect the sovereignty of the country in the long run?
I think Sri Lanka has come under a lot of pressure over the recent years, and some countries were responding to pressures that they were being subjected to by the human rights community and the diaspora, which was unfortunate, and they were responding to local political demands. So the victim of that was Sri Lanka. There are many other countries in the world who are probably in a worse situation than us, but they don't come under the same pressure. So, but as a country, we need to deal with it. We can't avoid it, we can't escape it. So we can't blame the international community. We ourselves need to respond to it. We need to deal with it.
So we are on the right track in terms of moving forward on the Human Rights High Commissioner's report.
As I said earlier, we have a challenge here. We have to deliver on the expectations of the countries that promoted that resolution in Geneva.
What is the way forward for a country like Sri Lanka? 10 years in the UN system, 5.5 years as a diplomat. What is the way forward for Sri Lanka?
It's very important to consolidate our relationship with the UN as an organization, with the Secretary General, because the Secretary General has inordinate influence in the international arena. We need to build our relations with those countries that have been critical of us in the past, and I think that's a special challenge. We also, at the same time, not forget the countries that stood by us when we were in difficulty.
You left a top job in the United Nations in the year 2006, Dr. Khona. Now you were recalled by the present regime. If you were invited to take up a post in the Foreign Service by the present regime, what would be your response?
In 2006, I left this job and came back to Sri Lanka because I had the opportunity to serve the country. And if I'm given that opportunity to serve the country, I will do it again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khona, for joining us right here on Newsline.
Thank you.
One year and 1 month after, here we are today. Mr. Hao Liang-Zhu, the United Nations Assistant Secretary General, Chair of the United Nations Development Group Asia Pacific, arrived in Sri Lanka 1 year after. What is the purpose of his visit this time around? A very good evening to you and welcome to BizFirst in Focus. Starting off, tell me, why did you come to Sri Lanka?
Yeah.
What is the purpose of your visit?
Thank you. We all know that on 8th of January, a very important political event took place in Sri Lanka. The election voted in a new president, and as a result, there is a new government. And there's a lot of enthusiasm in the world about this change. And there's very high hopes that the new government may represent a departure in terms of policies from the past. And I think from our point of view, it's always critical to engage the new government, to understand the emerging priorities, emerging issues, so that our support can be relevant, can stay relevant and effective. This is why I'm here, to really meet senior government officials, meet our colleagues, to understand the new reality.
You did meet several high-ranking officials attached to the government during your stay in Sri Lanka.
Right.
What were the meetings focused on?
I think the meetings really are focusing on emerging issues. Okay, what we needed to do, right, to meet the aspirations of the people. For example, during my last visit, we didn't spend much money on macroeconomic issues and economic planning. But this time we actually had some discussions about these kind of issues, right? Because for the country to develop sustainably, right, inclusively, and in a resilient way, we do need to look at some of the structural challenges, in the economy. For example, what is the next growth engine, right? And where would the jobs come from, right? And how do you deal with the existing pension system that may need reform, right, in order for this to be sustainable and so forth. So these issues, when emerging issues, right, we talk about this, but along with other issues.
You just said, Mr. Zhu, that during your last time in Sri Lanka, you did not speak about development-oriented issues. However, this time around, you did speak about development-oriented issues.
Right.
What does this mean? Does this mean that the United Nations has changed its policy towards Sri Lanka suddenly when a government was elected?
Okay. And first of all, I have to correct you that I didn't say I didn't discuss development issue last time. I said I didn't discuss macroeconomic issues, right? And last time I definitely discussed development issues as well as this time. And development to us encompasses the socio-economic environment and the many aspects of it. So this is important clarification. And in terms of your question about UN position towards Sri Lanka, and as I mentioned on several occasions, our commitment to Sri Lanka does not change and has not changed. Okay, and every government that comes in brings new perspective, and our job is to understand these perspectives. And every government represents the people's wishes through elections. We need to understand these wishes. So I would say that we have the same commitment and the position towards Sri Lanka, but we need to understand, what this new reality means to our work, to our collaboration.
You spoke about macroeconomic issues, and you responded to my earlier question, and you said development issues were discussed, but macroeconomic issues obviously were not discussed. Correct me if I'm wrong, yes or no?
I think, again, in a meeting, in 1 hour meeting, you cannot expect to cover everything, right?
However, this time around, you spent a much more cordial discussion with the present regime. Right? Yes. Does that mean that the United Nations disliked the previous regime and how it worked?
No, I think I think the fact that I met key ministers, both in the previous government and in the present government shows that we engage, and without any difference. Okay, our interest is to support the government and to support the development of Sri Lanka, and we want to be effective. We have to engage with senior government officials on policy issues, right, and on decisions that will affect how we formulate and implement our programs. So I don't really see any change in our approach, and different governments, will provide different priorities and how the programs can be formulated. So I think for us, as I said before, our commitment to Sri Lanka's development doesn't change.
One of the accusations leveled at the previous regime was the fact that it did not cooperatively work with the United Nations in terms of human rights and accountability issues. This government, do you see positive engagement in the future?
Again, this issue is mostly dealt with by our colleagues in High Commissioner for Human Rights, and my work primarily focuses on socio-economic development issues. Mm-hmm. So I would say that I would leave how UN engagement with Sri Lanka on human rights issues to our colleagues, in human rights, a High Commissioner for Human Rights. But I would say that many of our work, engagement with Sri Lanka, even in areas of our work, have direct impact on human rights. Right? One of our 2 program pillars is governance. Right? Mm-hmm. And we have an ongoing project which is called Improvement of Rule of Law, Access to Justice, and Social Inclusion, which is really addressing some of the core governance and human rights issues. One of the activities under this program that we're undertaking this year mm-hmm. is to come up with a policy on legal aid. Right? This directly helps improvement of the rights of the poor and the vulnerable. Right? This is also human rights. Human rights has many aspects. Right? This afternoon I visited the Inspector General of the Sri Lanka Police, right, and handed over a guide, on how to handle sexual and gender-based violence, mm-hmm. right. So in his word, this kind of work, directly helps the protection of human rights and help create a fear-free society. Right? So we have many aspects of rights issue, and we are doing our part to contribute to a better rights for everyone.
And how do you see the United Nations pitching in the future course of development in the country?
I think there are so many ways where we can work together, right? And in the past, UNDP was a donor, okay, right? We had a sizable financial contribution for Sri Lanka. Now that Sri Lanka is a middle-income country, right, and is a high human development country, right? So our financial contribution to Sri Lanka is negligible. Right? So we will increasingly focus on our value added. Okay, what value we can bring to Sri Lanka's development through our expertise, through the trust, for example, we have in the government has in us, right? That we can work on sensitive issues, right, of reconciliation. Support for resettlement, for example.
During our meetings with the President administration, were you able to communicate this to them?
Absolutely, of course, definitely. I told every senior official that don't see UNDP as a donor, see us as an equal partner in development. Okay, right. And one thing we discussed a lot is how do you use innovation in development, right?
Is it going to be financial assistance, or in which way is assistance going to come into Sri Lanka? Is it going to be financial assistance, or what does that mean?
There will always be financial assistance, right? But the money doesn't have to come from us, right? The money can come from bilateral donors, can come from multilateral sources, can also from Sri Lankan government, because the projects we have are not our projects. It is Sri Lankan projects, right?
It's the knowledge of the expertise that...
Knowledge, expertise.
So what does that mean? Does that
principles.
mean that special mandate holders will arrive in Sri Lanka anytime soon? The special mandate holders?
Right. Again, this is not in the immediate area of our work. It is handled by Office for High Commissioner for Human Rights. But the special mandate holders are visiting regularly. Recently, there was a visit... So it's a long name for me to, but essentially the mandate holders are visiting, okay, and there was one last week on truth and reconciliation in a way, right? So the government is cooperating with the UN, with the Human Rights Commission on these kind of issues.
There's uncertainty in terms of Sri Lankan politics. 8th of January there was a change of regime. Mm-hmm. The president announced today that there will be an election after the 20th of April, after the 19th Amendment to the Constitution is passed in Parliament.
Yes. Yes.
Do you think
this is the way forward for a country like Sri Lanka, or do you think that this should change?
Yeah, I think the political life of Sri Lanka is taking place based on the constitution, right? And yes, there are uncertainties with these political changes.
Does that help the UN?
Yeah, but the president will be there, right? The president is elected for 5 years, and he's just been elected. So there's a continuity, right? And so I'm not worried about these political changes. And what's important is that elections are conducted in a fair and transparent way that provides a clear mandate, right, to the next parliament and next government. But once we have that, we have a stable presidency, we have a clear parliament and a government with a clear mandate from the people. So we move forward from there. Right? So I think this is not for foreigners to speculate. I think only Sri Lankans, can make sure that and the political process move forward in a constructive and a positive way for the future of Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zhu, for joining us right here.
Okay, thank you very much.